Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today we're starting with the furniture from Madeline's house with making a wood-burning cooking stove. On this stove, the vent and doors open and close, and all of the burner and burner plates can be removed. Don't forget to check the link in the description where you will find the list of materials and the free printable pattern that you can use to make this for yourself. Before we get started on the main body, we're going to make the legs so they have time to dry. Instead of carving them like I did the first time, we're going to try using beads. The bottom of the stove is meant to be at about an inch off the floor. For me, that was a big round wood bead, a large oval bead, and a tiny oval bead. To glue my beads together, I used resin, but if you don't have any or you don't like to use resin, you can use E6000 or even baking soda and super glue. Because we are covering them with clay, the buildup won't matter. Once you have your legs the way you want them, set them aside and we're going to pull out our clay and tools. I'm using DOS paper clay over cold porcelain because cold porcelain does have a tendency to shrink, and because I'm not covering the whole legs with it, I figured the cold porcelain would pull away and it wouldn't work. Because my clay is old, I added glue to it to recondition it. Once your clay is ready, roll out a small snake. Then add a touch of water to your surface area. This helps the clay stick. If you still have a problem with the clay sticking to the wood, you can use glue just as we did the water. Next, wrap the snake of clay around your joints and then smooth it out with your fingers or tools. Keep going until you have the desired shape you want. Repeat the process for the other 3 legs. Set them aside to dry, and then we're going to move on to cutting our pieces out. For most of this piece I used chipped board, but for the top that was a little bit too thin, so I doubled up the layers to make it a bit thicker. Once I had them glued together, I taped the edges and put something heavy over top of them to help prevent any bowing or curling. I let them dry for a few days before gluing the pattern down and cutting them out. It's a good idea to go ahead and use a craft knife here because we want to save the inserts for later. Take your time and try to stay on the line. For the vent grate, make sure to leave the little tabs on that are there because we need to fold those to make it stand away from the stove so we can slide the back piece in and out. Once you have it completely cut out, take a ball tool and make a crease at each tab so we can fold them. But make sure you're doing it on the side that's going to be facing away from you. I didn't sand the one side of chipboard, so that's going to be the side that's facing the stove. I test fit it just to make sure it works. If you want to round the back corners on the inside vent piece, that would probably be a good idea so it doesn't get caught when you slide it in and out. For my stove, I decided to make the doors out of wood. If you wanted to make yours out of the chipboard, go for it. That will work just fine. But you may want to double your layers to make it look thicker. I'm not exactly for sure what these pieces are called, but I called them the plates and the burners. The plates, the rectangle ones, and then the burners, the little circles. You'll need 3 of the big plates, 3 of the small plates, 6 of the big burners, and 6 of the little burners. If you wanted more options, you could leave a set of plates solid without cutting the holes out, and that'll give you a griddle plate that you can change out. To make sure all of our pieces are uniform and the holes are in the right place, you can roll up a piece of sandpaper around a marker or around itself. Once you have everything sanded the way you like it, we can move on to gluing our pieces together. And since we've already got the stovetop plates on our table, we might as well start with them. And for the plates, it needs to go big over top of small. And that goes for the burner circles as well. They need to go big over top of small. And for the stovetop framework, it needs to go the other way around with a little on top of the big. Set all that aside to dry, and then we're going to start making the boxes for the inside of the stove. Each door has its own compartment to give it a little more realism. The easiest way that I found to glue these together was to take a long piece of tape, add glue along the edges that need to be glued together, and keep going until you've got a square. Not only does the tape hold the sides together until it dries, it also helps keep its shape. Also, if you wanted to put a shelf inside of the stove, this would be a good time to do it. I used square dowels on the inside of mine, but then decided against putting the rack in. But at least I do have the railing if I ever decide to change my mind. Once you have all of your boxes put together, set them aside to dry, and we're going to move on to the stove doors. For this, we'll need some aluminum, but aluminum foil won't work. Your best bet is a throwaway baking pan. If you look at your pattern paper, I do have the little spots where it tells you how wide you need your strips to be, and I would say about 1 inch long each. You'll also need your thick aluminum wire. I'm using a toothpick, but I should have used the wire that I was going to use on the stove. Start at one end of your aluminum and give it a good tight 3 rolls. We want it to be super tight up against our wire. That's what's going to help hold it closed. Because I used the toothpick, mine was a little bit bigger and my doors don't stay closed. Once you have all of your hinges made, we're going to start with the big stove door. Because we're sticking metal to wood, it's a good idea to use E6000 or some other multi-surface glue. You'll need to glue it with the curl facing towards the front side of the door, and sits right up against the underneath side edge. Add more of the multi-surface glue to the back side of the aluminum. Then add wood or tacky glue to the wood part. Then use the leftover parts from where we cut out the stove and glue that on the back side to cover up the hinges. Repeat the process for all the doors except for the vent. Before we move on to putting the rest of the stove together, we need to go ahead and paint it because it's a lot easier to do while it's apart because even the inside needs painted. The stove in the movie is a dark hunter green color, so that's what I'm going to go with. I would go with a glossy paint so that way it gives it the shiny look like a stove has. Give everything a good coat, front and back. Oh, and don't forget about the legs. You may need to sand them a bit before you paint them though. Once the doors have had time to dry, we're going to put a little bit of detail on them with wire. I've used this method in the past on a canopy bed and I really liked how it turned out. And the stove in the movie actually has some sort of trim around the doors as well, so I figured this was a good time to try it again. I'm using a really thin jeweler's wire, but speaker wire would work too. I believe that's what I used on the canopy bed. I found it easier to bend the wire and get it in shape before gluing it down. And because the stove already has a shiny coat, we don't have to worry about using the super glue and it showing through. And even if it does, we can go back over it with our paint and just wipe our finger across the wire and it'll come clean, so you'll still be able to see it. Or you can always sand it, but that might be harder on the little doors. Once you have the shape you want, trim the excess off. And now we're ready to start gluing it down. It would have been better if I would have used a ball stylist or a silicone tool to help hold the wire down while it dried, so that way I didn't glue myself to myself. But like I say, if you're working with super glue and you haven't glued yourself to something, then you're not doing it right. Anyway, take your time and work your way all the way around the doors until you meet back up at the other end. Now that we've gotten our wire detail on, we can add our handles to the doors. I used oval beads cut in half, but if you have a different or better idea, go for it. Next, we're going to finish up the hinges, and I've left you with a few options just in case you wanted to try something different. Looking at your pattern piece, you have a bunch of little red dots everywhere. These are where you're supposed to poke the holes in your stove front so we can attach the wire. With that, there are the options of if you want just one long piece of wire like I'm using for mine, or if you wanted to use short ones for each individual hinge. Using the thick wire that you're going to for your hinges, grab your pliers and about 1/4 of an inch away from the end, make a right angle. Then stick the wire through the hinge and give it another right angle at the other end. Just make sure that they're going the same direction. Next, using the door hinge as a guide, mark out where you need to poke your holes into the stove face and poke your holes with a pokey tool. And I know my stove is a little bit further than what yours is at this point, but very rarely do I ever do anything in the order that it should be done. And this is one of those parts where I should have poked the holes and put the doors on before I put the boxes on. I'm just glad I caught it before I had the stove completely put together. Anyway, we're ready to put the stove doors on. Stick your wire ends through the holes and try to keep it as close to the stove as possible. Then flip it over and use something like resin or E6000 and put a nice big gob over top of the back end of the wire. No one will ever see this area. It doesn't matter if it don't look pretty. Now that we have the doors on, we can finish up the vent grate thing. We need to make a handle for the slidey part. You'll need a flat-headed jewelry pin, a small round wooden bead, and a pokey tool. Use the pokey tool to poke a hole in the rounded end of the vent. Then put the wood bead on the jewelry pin, and then poke the pin through the hole in the vent. Trim the wire on the back about a 1/16 of an inch out, then glue it in place. I used resin, of course. And this is what it looks like up close. Okay, now we're ready to put the whole stove together. Start with the inside boxes first, and I used regular tacky glue for this. Once you have them all glued on, give them a few minutes to dry, and then we can start putting together the outside with the sidewalls. In the movie, I can see that there's a stovepipe on one side of the stove, and I've made that optional for you if you want to use it. I'm still trying to figure out the stovepipe for myself. And I know I'm using tape to hold mine together. Although you can't use tape on the outside because of the paint job, you can use the tape on the inside to hold it together while it dries. Next, add the vent grate. Next is the inside top shelf. Set it down in there and push it down in until it touches the top of the boxes. Then the stove top. Flip it over and then glue on the bottom. And while we're waiting for that to dry, let's add some more detail. Use a nail file or some sort of other file to make a notch or indent in the side of them, just big enough to fit the aluminum wire through. Because we're also going to make a lid lifter. Using the aluminum wire and a pair of pliers or even a hammer, smash down the end of the wire so it's flat, and give it a little bit of a bend. Add on an oval wood bead. Then cut your wire about a 1/2 of an inch away from your first bend. Then glue your bead in place. I used resin for mine. Next, glue the legs on, and yours should already be painted at this point, I think. And lastly, if there's anything left that needs to be painted, go ahead and paint it. And with that, it brings us to the end of our tutorial. If you've made it this far, thank you for being here. As always, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.